Hello everyone, in today's video we're going to be taking a look at what's different with the instrumentation on a helicopter versus on an airplane. Let's get started. So when it comes to helicopters, the biggest difference when it comes to engine instrumentation has to do with determining the performance of the engine itself versus more traditional what we're used to on an airplane. One of the things you'll notice is as I look down here is you don't see any evidence of a tachometer, the tachometer in the sense that we think of it, but the reality is we do have a tachometer in a helicopter, but instead of measuring it in RPM, we're going to be measuring it in percentage of ideal RPM. One of the things you'll actually notice here, if you look carefully, is we have this little green bar here, and you'll probably observe that for my E, which refers to my engine RPM, it's somewhere between, we'll call that 101 and a 103%, whereas for my rotor, it's about the same RPM. So let's go ahead and get this thing started real quick. I'll keep it nice and simple. Toss on the fuel guard. We'll go ahead and turn on the master battery. We're going to go ahead and crank the starter. Go ahead and pop the clutch right away. And what you'll observe here is that my engine RPM immediately starts to come up, but my rotor RPM is lagging. The reason that the rotor RPM is lagging here is on account of the fact, if you listen, we are actually engaging a clutch that links the engine RPM to the actual rotor RPM here. So even though my engine's turning at 55% of ideal RPM, my rotor is just now starting to catch up to my actual engine here. Now I'm going to go ahead and get everything else engaged here. We're going to flip on our little governor here. And what we're going to do is we're just going to slowly bring up our power here. And now, as you can see, as our engine RPM comes up, because they are now clutched to each other through a gearbox, they are actually going to be moving together. This is one of the big differences. Now, in a helicopter, when we're interested to know how much power we're using in a given situation, this isn't really going to help us. This can definitely tell us if we're in the danger zone. You can see that distinctive red line there right around 90% RPM. But the other thing is, if we actually want to know how much power we're using or how hard we're working our particular engine at any given point, we have to look at a secondary gauge. Now, for this particular helicopter, our secondary gauge is going to be a manifold pressure gauge, which is going to be notifying us basically how much of a vacuum your engine's, how hard is your engine sucking, if you want to think about it. You can notice right now that because we're governed, we are moving at 1 RPM, even though our engine power is set differently. So let's go ahead and create some load on this helicopter here. I'm going to go ahead and lift up my collective. Now, as I lift up my collective, what you're going to notice here is my RPM stays more or less fixed while my engine power, as you can see measured by manifold pressure gauge, starts to increase. Now, the interesting thing here is you can actually watch as if I move the collective up and down, you can see we're getting a little light on the skids there, that it basically chases itself because it's only going to be using as much power as it needs to maintain that consistent RPM. Let's go ahead and now reduce the power here. I should say reduce the collective. I'm not touching power. That's what the governor's for. Now, if you take a look at the rest of the instrumentation, at least on this helicopter, you'll see it's relatively straightforward. Things that work exactly the same way as you're probably familiar with on an airplane. Now, where it gets a little different is when we transition to a turbine helicopter. Now, climbing into a turbine helicopter, things are pretty similar, but they're going to be actually more in line with what you're probably expecting on something that's perhaps PT6 power, like a turboprop. What you're going to observe here is we have a different measurement of how hard we're working our engine. We have our tachometer, which you're probably very familiar with. We have our N2, which is basically going to be the bit that's going to be turning the rotor, and then you have your rotor RPM, as well as a very wide range in here. Now, if we were to get this one started, which is going to be a little bit different, I'll make sure my fuel valve is set. I got my starter. You can see I can beat my engine for RPM should I need to do so. Just checking to make sure all my switches are correct here. Looks pretty good to me. So I'll reach down here. I love how this one starts. You just go and all you do is you crank the starter button. I just love it. Click. Enable the starter. Let's do it. All right, so we have a bunch of different instrumentation, and I'll let that kind of go through its motions, its ministrations. I'll use that fun word here. So one of the things you'll notice here is we have the same idea as far as RPM. N2, again, is going to be the fast part of our gas turbine. It's the one that we're actually going to be capturing for the purposes of rotating our rotor. We have a rotor RPM, which you can see is the same similar sort of Now, coming down here, we have a different type of instrument, and that is an engine torque percentage instrument, which is going to be letting us know, just like our manifold pressure gauge did over in our Robinson to R22, how hard we're basically working the engine at a given point. And you can see here, we're using about 5 or 6% of the torque. And the cool thing is, if I look above my head, you can see that thing is barely rotating at this particular point because we're not going very hard on anything along those lines. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and take my throttle here, and I'm just going to gently roll it up to get myself a little bit more of RPM. And we're going to try to get this thing up into the green range where the governor is basically going to take control and sort of do all the work of maintaining the constant RPM for us. Give it a few moments to catch it. And cool, you can see how we are now locked at our basically our smooth 100% RPM. We could beat the throttle up a little bit if we wanted, but we're not going to. Now, there's other type of instrumentation you're probably going to be observing. If I move my head down here, you will see that we have a couple of, the standard oil pressure, oil temperature, things like that. But you'll also notice that we have a gas temperature. This is measured gas temperature. And you'll also notice we have an N1, which is basically going to be the first half of our turbine, whereas the N2 is measuring the second half of our turbine here. What you'll observe here is this is basically how fast, if you want to think about your engine's actually turning right now. And this is the part that we're actually capturing. Now, the cool thing about gas turbines is the front half of the gas turbine does not have to move at the speed of the back half of the gas turbine, which naturally, because they're not mechanically connected to each other, our turbine's cool, you can see that they're not going to be moving at the speed of our rotor. So one of the things that makes our helicopter challenging to operate now is the fact that we not only need to make sure we stay within the appropriate temperature range for a turbine, we have to also make sure we're staying within the appropriate torque band. Now, people who are familiar with turboprops, this is your bread and butter. You deal with this all the time. But the thing that makes us kind of fun is this becomes more of an issue with altitude. This becomes more of an issue at lower altitudes. So I should have said high altitude, low altitude. So let's go ahead and get this thing up in the air. Again, I'm not going to be nice about this or precise or even polite to the guy who's standing right next to me with a giant truck filled with explosives. Actually, I think that's a GPU truck. So let's go ahead and get this thing going here. I gotta love this helicopter. It takes very, very little effort to get it going. The R66 is so nice. It's kind of neat that we have an R22 and an R66. I feel like we're missing out because we don't have the R44, which is okay. So what you can see here is we've gotten past our 60 knots or so. That's going to be basically our VY, if you want to think about it in terms of helicopters. Do we have a VX in a helicopter? If we can go straight up, please don't go straight up in a helicopter. It's very dangerous. So one of the things we'll notice here is a couple things. First of all, you can see our rotor RPM is more or less the same. You can see our N2 has dropped a little bit because we're loading our rotor pretty hard. You can see our engine torque there is chilling about 57%. Obviously, it's going to be changing constantly because the governor is going to be trying to get us the optimum power level there. And you can see our MGT has gone up, and you can see our N1 has gone up as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and gently, trying to be gentle. Oh my gosh, this is going to require every bit of left foot I have here. Whoa, too much. We're going to go up to about 80% torque there, which is pretty darn high. You can see my rotor RPM actually dropped. The other thing you'll notice is my N1 RPM is spiked. We're actually working very, 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 very hard. And I'm having to push my left foot pretty far forward here on a helicopter in order to maintain a straight line here. Oof. But as you can see, as we're starting to pick up speed here, we're doing about $1.20, which is pretty darn fast for a helicopter like this. The other thing you'll probably observe too is my MGT and my engine torque are peaking. And if I look down and look back up, you can see I'm right about ready to flip this helicopter over because of just how much we're asking from it. Now, there's one more element we want to take a look at in a helicopter while I'm kind of cruising around here. I'm going to go ahead and reduce my torque to a human level here and not I'm trying to rip the rotor blades off the top of the helicopter level. That would be very, very polite of me. And that's the fact our airspeed indicator looked different between this helicopter and our buddy over there in the Robinson 22. This airspeed indicator, you probably observe, has a very, very, very long green arc that always goes all the way from 0 up to 110. If you looked at the R22, you probably remember that it started at about 50 knots. The reason for that is in this particular aircraft, because we have so much excess power, we're basically safe, basically in all those speed ranges. Whereas in R22, once you start getting slow, you put yourself into a very hazardous position as far as the power that you might need in order to maintain safe flight. So it's kind of a neat little trick there. Another thing you probably noticed in the R22 is the fact we had a red line that was at the top of our green arc, whereas with this helicopter, our red line is chilling there at the top of the yellow arc, which makes it just a little bit different of a helicopter. So as you can see, the biggest differences between the two is going to come down to engine instrumentation. We've got our N1, N2, we've got our rotor speed, we've got our engine speeds, and we also almost always have some measurement of how much torque we're using at a given moment, or basically how hard we're working the engine, so we know if we're keeping everything within safe parameters. Enjoy.